The following broadcast was produced by the Lighthouse for the Blind in San Francisco as part of our Lighthouse Learning Library.
Julie McCarthy, the Princess of Light, will be talking about something near and dear. We've been talking about getting that job, snagging it, finding the right person, preparing for it, doing everything right. You know, you don't count as a closure with rehab unless you're employed for a full 90 days, which is not a whole lot of time. And the statistics are that a lot of people wash out. And they wash out because you're on your own, and sometimes there are things you do at the office that mother didn't tell you. And we've got somebody here who has seen just about every wrong thing that an employee can do while employed, or just before they were unemployed. Julie has kept us all on the straight and narrow at the Lighthouse, where she's been HR manager for quite a long time now. So far, I've been able to retain my job, so I have to stay on the good side of Julie. So, for reflections and experiences, Julie McCarthy.
So I'm going to talk a little bit, like we did yesterday, about some of my personal experiences. They may be anecdotal, but they're all true. Yesterday we talked about how some people have blown their interview opportunities, not realizing their interview had already begun when they hit send. And so we talked about some of those stories. But let's say you get past the Dragon Lady, okay? You have grabbed Excalibur, you've got that job. And that dragon has breathed fire on you, but you are unsinged because you, my friend, you're as cool as the other side of the pillow. So now you've got that job, and how are you going to keep it? There are things that we can all do to improve our chances. Remember yesterday, Mr. Xavier said he hired someone in a layoff environment at the state, and he told her on her first day, you're here in the morning, but you could be gone in the afternoon. The state's laying off. I can't really control all that. So there are situations that you cannot control, but there are perhaps things you can do that may improve your chances of sticking around a little longer than lunchtime. And I did have a job where people like to come in. It was a hard place to work, so they would be hired in the morning, and then they'd leave for lunch, and they'd never come back. This happened several times. Like, oh, where's Arvid? He's been gone 3 days now. I guess he's not coming back. So that was more a function of the job than the employees. So in my mind, there are probably half a dozen ways that we can help to keep our jobs. Half of those are relationships. Who do you think is important to have a good relationship with at work? Boss, absolutely. Who else? Your immediate coworkers, and who else? I'm thinking globally, because even in a small company, you may not work with... Yeah, I guess I'm thinking more broadly. Boss, absolutely, which would perhaps include supervisor. Your immediate... Yeah, it depends. If you've got a sales job, some people will never deal with clients. So just to keep it simple, I broke it down into half a dozen categories. Boss? No. I'll tell you the three. Your boss, your immediate supervisor, immediate coworkers rather, and the company in general, because you may not work with every single person very closely, but you still want to make a good impression, right? So you've gotten that call from the hiring manager, you get to start on Monday. Can you think of anything that you could do maybe in that phone call to sort of lay the groundwork for your very first day at work? Anything? Those things are important. Oh, they don't care at that point. They've already committed to you, Ramona. Well, see, that's what I'm thinking, Ramona. I'm thinking that you might want to sort of find out where you're going to report. Maybe after the offer's been made, if it's possible, maybe you can get a tour of the place so you know where you will be working. If that's not possible before employment, thank you.
Can you switch mics?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks. If it's not possible,
Oh, could you turn on one of the table mics?
got it. To get a tour, maybe you could just ask them to talk you through. I have no idea if this is on.
That's not as good, no.
Okay. Testing.
No.
That's not me, it's Kathy.
Shen?
Okay. There you
There
go.
you are.
All right. So perhaps you can find out where you're going to be working, what kind of environment you'll be in. It doesn't necessarily require a personal tour. Yesterday, Mike was talking about spending an hour and a half in a courtroom mapping it out so that he would know where everything was before the trial began. If you can get that kind of access, and I'm not talking to you as blind job seekers, I just mean any job seeker. If you can get a physical idea of where you'll be working, it's always helpful. To whom should you report when you get there? Are you going to punch in? Where are you going to park? Where are you going to sit? Where are you going to eat? Does the employer allow personal items in the workplace? These are things you might be able to find out in that conversation that you're going to have before you actually report. And then your first day might be a little smoother. You'll have less anxiety, and so will the employer. One thing that I run into a lot, especially with people who have not worked for a while or they're young employees, one of the things that HR is going to ask you for almost immediately after you walk in the door is documentation that you have the right to work in the US, documentation that you can't ask for prior to employment. So we're going to ask you to fill out something called an I-9 form. Now, that may not be mentioned to you in the interview process, but it will be mentioned to you probably on the first day of work. And I can't tell you how many problems I have getting the correct documentation. The form was just, I think in May, some new regs were finalized. There's a list of acceptable documents that you could find online if you were really motivated, because the employer can't tell you what to bring in. I cannot say bring in a California ID and a Social Security card, but I can suggest those things. If you have a passport, that's good. So it's either one thing from what's called List A, like a passport, or one thing from B and one thing from C. And when I'm dealing with young people especially, I hear, well, my birth certificate, my mother has that. Okay, how about your Social Security card? Well, my grandmother has that. The issue is that if you're not able to clear your right to work within 3 days of employment, you are supposed to be terminated. So this is serious. When I ask you, as I did one young man, can you get your hands on your Social Security card? Well, my grandmother's in Louisiana, I'll try to get it. And then sometimes they'll get the card, but it's not signed, and I'll say, can you please sign the card? It's not valid without your signature. Oh, boy, my mother didn't tell me if I could sign it or not. I've got to call her. And I'm like, look, how about you just sign the card and trust me on this? Because I may be the first employer who's asked you for it, but I won't be the last. So have those documents handy. Know if you've got a certified copy of a birth certificate or a Native American tribal document, or nowadays a passport from the Federated States of Micronesia has been added to this form. I don't know about you. I didn't know that the Micronesian Islands were a federated state, but there you go. If you've got something that fulfills this requirement, is important, because if the employer is going to follow the letter of the law and you don't have it, again, you will wash out in 3 business days. I think you need to read the handbook as soon as you can. I don't like to give the handbook to anyone to whom an offer has not been extended, but once that's been done, certainly you might want to look at the handbook ahead of time. Ask questions when you get there and write down the answers so you're not asking the same question 6 times because you can't remember it, things like that. Learning the language. Now, when I got to LightHouse, it was my first nonprofit experience, and people were talking in shorthand all around me, and I'm still not sure 9 years later that I've got all the acronyms, but CCB, NFB, ACB, what are these things? OCB, I thought someone was talking about gambling, it's just... And so you're trying to figure these things out, and maybe you don't want to stand up in all staff and say, excuse me, I don't know what the Independent Living Center is. You may not want to do that, but maybe in a quiet moment, you can ask for the full names, look up the organizations, try to get familiar with the shorthand that people can use in the workplace. Anybody here very technical? I know Dean is. One of the first software companies I went to work for, they told me they needed someone who was good at GUI. I didn't know GUI was an acronym for a graphic user interface. At the same time they asked me that, there was a little widget on the internet called GUI, G-O-O-E-Y. And it just helps you talk to people who are visiting the same websites as you. So I thought they wanted someone who's a specialized person in that, that surfing mechanism. And then weeks later, I saw GUI written down, G-U-I, and I realized that's what they meant. So I told the CTO about it, and he looked at me like I was a cyclops. What do you mean, what? I mean, GUI was something he said 100 times a day. It never occurred to him that I didn't know what he meant exactly. So I was off on this wild goose chase that I could have avoided. Now those are things that you can do in general. You can sort of get a global view of what's going on in the company, but you also certainly want to connect with your boss. So I recommend that you demonstrate your skill combination for which you were hired at every opportunity. And so things like self-management, someone mentioned time and attendance, that's going to be important. If you've got transferable skills, those are important too. Maybe you were hired to be a file clerk, but you're a great singer. Maybe you're like Debbie, you got us started yesterday with I'm Walking on Sunshine. You know, some transferable skill. Maybe you need a certification for a job. Maybe not at that moment when you get it, but perhaps the employer is going to give you a few weeks or months to get a certification. Or they don't ask for any certification at all, but you go out and get it just to stay current in your profession. You have to think about things like that. Now, I think more important than the handbook is the unwritten culture. I'll give you a couple of examples by what I mean. Sometimes you need to see the employer side of things, and it may not make sense to you. My first .com job, I was working in a place where, and I'm not exaggerating, before I got there, they were doing things like naked hot tubbing, okay, with each other. The company's gone, thank goodness, for obvious reasons. I don't know if I should be insulted or grateful. I was never asked to participate. I think we're all probably happy. Yeah, I'm certainly grateful. Anyhow, those were in the heydays before I got there, and this is in .com land, so it was a pretty much anything goes culture. But there was one rule someone told me early on: McCarthy, you cannot pop popcorn here. Don't do it under any circumstances. And I said, popcorn? That makes no sense to me. Well, as it turned out, the kitchen was right next to the conference room, and people burned the popcorn all the time. The smell would be held in the building all day long, and you'd be trying to have a meeting with venture capitalists or have an interview or something in we call it a fishbowl. The conference room was enclosed in glass. And that smell would just be so distracting, that burned popcorn. So that was the only real rule in the office. Well, one day we had a temporary employee. We'll call him Poindexter. Poindexter goes over to the microwave, and we start hearing a slow popping noise. Everyone draws in their breath. Oh no, what is Arvid doing? Or did I say Poindexter? It doesn't matter. Okay, Poindexter. So someone went over and said, hey, Poindexter, you really can't pop popcorn. And he was indignant. Well, why can't I? And we explained the boss didn't want the smell of burned popcorn in the air while we were trying to hold meetings in the conference room. And do you know what Poindexter said? What do you think? He said, this is America. I can have what I want for lunch. Nobody can tell me what I can have. So I'm going to have my popcorn. Oh, snap, snap. Yes. Now, I said he was a temp, and we were working in a very cool .com, and he was working on a very cool project. He burned that popcorn worse than any predecessor of his. It was so rank in there, I don't think the smell was gone even the next day. The boss walks in. We all look at him, deer in headlights. We made the CTO go tell him what had happened. Who popped popcorn? CTO went and told him. Did someone tell him the rule? Yes, sir, we told him the rule, but he did it anyway. Next day, I'm on the phone with the temp agency, ending his employment with us over something that was not in the handbook, but it was part of the unwritten culture that he chose to ignore. Okay, so now you can be at home and pop all the popcorn you want. It's fine. What was the point of him doing that? I had a colleague, Jennifer Yeagley, talking about one of her old bosses who had two rules: no balloons at any sort of events and no grape gum. And Jennifer didn't know what that meant. Well, the boss apparently had some sort of phobia, and this is a real phobia about popping balloons. So she was nervous when the room was full of balloons that they would be popping and it would scare people. And she just didn't like the smell of grape gum. So she didn't want to smell it on your breath. Now, of course, you could chew your grape gum and make a giant balloon out of it if you wanted to. But how long would you be there?
Not very long.
Earlier this year, any sports fans in the audience, NFL? So earlier this year, maybe some of you heard about the Green Bay Packers playing their hated rival. Do you remember who they?
Chicago Bears.
Yes, in the NFC Championship game, I think in January, just before going to the Super Bowl. Green Bay beats Chicago on the way to the Super Bowl. A car salesman in a Chicago suburb decides to go to work one day with a Green Bay Packer tie on. Now, the dealership had done some work with the Bears, and even if they hadn't, their customers are Bear fans, right? So here you walk in with a tie from their most hated rival. The salesman said, you know, I wore it because my grandma just passed, and she was a huge Packers fan, and so I'm doing it in her honor. And I thought that my boss was joking when they said, can you please not wear that tie? And the next thing I know, I'm fired. Boo-hoo. The employer said, you know what? We've done promotional stuff with the Bears, so this is not allowed here. We asked him 3 times to remove the tie, and he refused each time. So we terminated him. Now, he got a lot of publicity out of this story, and he got other job offers as a result, but do you think the employer had the right to terminate him over a stupid tie? Most of the comments that I saw under the story were trending towards the employee. Oh, how dare they? This is America, my rights, blah, blah, blah. But really, I don't think that he would really have much standing legally if that got to a court of law. Because it's not discrimination, which could be his only possible argument. If I don't want you to wear a Green Bay Packer tie in my workspace, well, that seems like a reasonable request. And he did receive those 3 warnings.
What about like if you're religious, you have to wear one of those turbans? You have to wear turbans, but they won't let you wear it.
That's a different story. In fact, there's a case right now with Disneyland. Dean was asking, what if you've got to wear something for religious reasons? Disney right now, I think, is still embroiled in a case with the woman who wanted to wear a hijab. And Disney has, they call their employees, I want to say characters. Yeah, in the handbook, I'm thinking it's characters, but it's something like that. Cast members, thank you. And and if you need an accommodation, they will usually make it for you. So if you need a head covering for some reason, they'll make something that they think is in step with other costuming. This woman says, it's an insult what you wanted me to wear. I want to wear my thing, and you're discriminating against me. And Disney says, you know what, we offered her reasonable accommodation. She read the handbook. She signed this waiver. We're not asking her not to cover her head. We're just asking her to keep in character, and we can supply her with the materials. And I don't think that case has been resolved yet. There was a big march. I know she caused a bit of a scene at Disney. It may be settled out of court, that's what I'm thinking. Because Disney has accommodated other people with similar needs. And this woman said, no, I don't think that's a reasonable thing. So how will the court see it? I don't really know. Carol?
Oh, I just wanted to say back to the, oh, okay. I think that would have been a good lawsuit, because if it's not stated in the handbook, and if it's not having to do with his job performance, then he probably could have.
So Carol's saying the Green Bay Packers fan? Is that what you're talking about? That maybe he had grounds for a lawsuit because it wasn't stated implicitly in the handbook that he couldn't wear this tie. I'm thinking, yeah, she says it has nothing to do with job performance. I remember an episode of Seinfeld where George had a fantasy about having a sexual encounter with a cleaning lady. Did any of you see that? He fantasized about having an after-hours liaison in the office on one of the desks. And then he got his opportunity. The boss found out about it and fired him on the spot, and George said, well, if somebody had told me that wasn't proper, if it had been in the handbook, I wouldn't have done it. You can't anticipate every single situation somebody might be in. So you can't legislate for everything, or the handbook's completely unusable. But if the employer is making a reasonable request, it's not as if he was fired without any warning, then it'd be much harder to say, well, you know, the employer could have accommodated me and they didn't. But that's what courts are for, Carol, so I don't really know how the courts would have seen the case, but just on the surface, from what I read in the news reports, it didn't seem like he had the world's strongest case. Sexual harassment's a completely different thing. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Oh, sure.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to explain that everybody is an at-will employee, and so unless you're in a protected class and you're being discriminated because of that classification, then you can be fired. You can't. Being a Green Bay Packer fan is not a protected class.
Yeah.
You know, being fired because of your disability, you probably have a lawsuit, or being fired because of your religion or something, maybe.
And Sarah worked for an attorney, as I recall. I was going
There is kind of an exception with union employees. It's not exactly at will. You have often more protection under union contracts.
They're covered by CBAs, collective bargaining agreements, and they can negotiate things away that perhaps an employer in a private setting cannot do. And Sarah's right. At-will employment is the standard in most states. You can nullify at-will depending on what's in a handbook or a private contract between you and the employer. But across the board, usually, at-will employment is assumed going in. Of course, in California, everyone's in a protected class, right? Everyone is disabled under California law, basically. Everyone's over 40 or a minority or overweight or too tall or their mother didn't love them or something, and it just seems to fall under some protected class. So That's why the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which hears a lot of California cases, comes up with such interesting decisions. They get interesting cases, come up with decisions, sometimes unfathomable, that affect a lot of people. Now, one thing that really gets me is presenting solutions and not problems. I think one of the presenters earlier today mentioned that. If you notice a problem, don't just mention it to mention it, have a solution. We at LightHouse are on Van Ness Avenue, and it can be kind of a squirrely place sometimes. Some of the denizens are not, we don't want to invite them in necessarily. And so there are situations sometimes out on the sidewalk, and I've gone out and I've negotiated with homeless people, please don't tip over our garbage cans, or if you do, please put the stuff back. I've called the police when things get rough. I've called Department of Public Works. And I remember one employee writing me this long email about how she was upset by something happening on the street and why couldn't I do something about it. The streets are not my jurisdiction, technically. But I didn't say it's not my job because that's not the right response. Instead, I said, you know, I've done A, B, C. Do you think I've missed something? Is there something else I can do? Because I don't know what else I can do besides go out there and talk to people or bring in people that are responsible for city streets. So if you think I've missed something, please let me know. Well, she didn't come up with any good suggestions. Why present the problem unless you had a possible solution? So don't just point it out just to be pointing it out, because the boss probably knows about it. Now, you don't always have to have a solution. We'll talk about that in a second. Also, I think it's important to do your job and not your passion. If you were hired as a file clerk, but you really love changing light bulbs, that's not what you were hired to do. And maybe you're really good at it and it's really needed. Now, I can tell you at LightHouse, we have several people who I swear are MacGyver. They are amazing. They've kept the place running. They've kept things from exploding. They've kept my head taped on. They are amazing. And so it's very helpful when they can step in and take care of some of these things, but that is not their primary job. And there's one person in particular, I'm always running around trying to find out what that person's doing because they want to be a handyman. It's obvious. I'll walk by, I'll see a light bulb's been changed, I'll think to myself, did Arvid do that? Yeah, probably. Someone's on the roof. Is that Arvid? Yeah. Where did that painting come from? Was Arvid down here with, you know, it's all day long. And I'm worried about Arvid's health. What happens if Arvid gets hurt? Well, they could lose a lot of time at work, right? So as a human being, I'm concerned that one of my colleagues could put themselves in a dangerous position. The cold-hearted HR nerd has to think, wow, we're paying workers' comp rates at a clerical rate, and this person is, you know, outside directing traffic. If they get hurt doing that, is the workers' comp carrier going to have something to say about that? So it's a big global issue. If that person would just concentrate on whatever their job is, I don't want their boss to think I'm asking them to go out and do all these other things either. So try to work within your job description. Other duties as assigned means your boss might assign those duties, but not you. You shouldn't necessarily assign them to yourself. I think it's important when you're working with your colleagues to keep boundaries in place. We've talked a little bit about boundaries during this summit. You need to maintain confidentiality. Don't do crazy things. Don't disclose too much personal information. I remember pulling one employee aside because he had some behavioral issues, and he spent the entire time saying, well, do you know what Violet over there is taking? What kind of neurotoxin she's putting in her body? Do you know what Petunia over there, what kind of medication regimen she's on? All these people had told him all of their personal information, so he deflected the counsel we were giving him with, you think I'm crazy? Let so-and-so go off their meds for a couple of days, you'll see crazy. They should not have been disclosing that information, and sometimes we get really familiar. We spend more time at work than we do with people that we love and choose to be with. And so sometimes we think we can go to work and make real friends, and you can. You can meet your closest friends there, your next business partner, your mate. But most people are not going to fall into that category. So be judicious, and that includes social networks. I was at an HR conference in June. Jackson Lewis was there. They're an employment law firm, large, well-known. They were talking about social media in the workplace. And a lot of people are on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. Sometimes it seems the whole world is plugged in some way. They made the point that if Facebook was a country, it'd be the world's third largest. I never thought of it that way. Behind China and India, then Facebook at 600 million, and then the US. So lots of presence there. 24 million American Facebook users leave their profiles mostly public. I'm quoting from one of their slides. 73% of social media profiles can be found through a public search engine. 77% of social network users do not restrict access to their photos. A 2007 study revealed that 45% of employers questioned use social networks to screen job candidates. And of these, 35% decided not to offer a job to an applicant based on the content posted. Facebook was the most popular for screening. 7% of employers follow job candidates on Twitter. Now, what is the employer looking for? Why are they all up in your business like that? Well, they're looking for discrimination, harassment, retaliation. They are concerned about negligent hiring and supervision. They have to worry about the divulgence of trade secrets or proprietary information, reputational harm to employees and the employer, privacy pitfalls, legal constraints on employee discipline. So they've got a lot to worry about, and you might just hand them the smoking gun. Now, there's a lot of talk about social media in the HR world because law is trying to catch up with some of the cases. Antiquated laws are being used to deal with these cases, and so the legal system needs to catch up to how much your right of privacy outweighs the employer's need to know, and what if the employer stumbles on something, and what if they found out something about you using nefarious means. All these things are being worked out in the courts right now. But in the meantime, you may not want to post bad things about your employer online. You may not want to tell, hey, Kathy, guess what? I've had it with Bashan today. Look at what I wrote on my blog. That could really backfire. You know, you may not want to write that stuff down. So I suggest that you be careful with how you share public networks and who you share them with. How about if you're in a situation where you've got a gossiper on staff? They are waiting for you so they can tell you what Rich Russo was doing the other day. He's one of my colleagues over here. And that's all they want to talk about. Every day it's Rich this, Rich that. Well, you're tired of hearing about it. Rich is not your problem. So any suggestions on how you can avoid getting caught up in the gossip mill? Mm-hmm.
Now it's on. The simple solution is don't gossip. And the second issue would be, if you're really concerned about it, to be mindful of your privacy settings on social networks and keep it private.
Yeah, if you're gossiping electronically, but what if you're gossiping in the office? I see a hand behind you, Kathy.
Oh, sorry. I got the mic over here with you.
Oh, okay.
You tell the person that you don't want to hear about it. You know, you don't want to hear them gossiping about other people in the office and everything, because it's not fair to that person.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking behind their back and everything, and that's just, it's not right.
Any other suggestions?
It's better to say nice things about what you did today. Nice things that like extracurricular activities that employers may suddenly want to look at and see, hey, you're still a well-rounded person. We like you.
But what if Rich didn't do anything good today and I'm dying to tell you about all the bad?
It's Josh, and I was just thinking that one of the things you could do if someone is doing gossiping and stuff, probably if they just did it first, I might say, oh, that's good information, but I actually need to go take care of this memo right there. We can talk later.
Avoidance. Yeah, some of you gave very mature answers. In an ideal world, everyone would do that. But if you're a new employee, you might feel intimidated about saying to someone, I don't want to hear that. Or maybe you're like me and you're really nosy and you do want to hear it. So you need to sort of police yourself, don't you? So maybe if you get caught up in these circles, like Shen's standing over by the water cooler now, and I see Shen, he's perfect. I can talk to him about anything. Maybe what I need to do is not go on break the same time Shen is going on break. Maybe it's as simple as that, to break that cycle. Because you start getting caught up in these cycles, and even if you didn't say anything, the fact that you were there could count against you. So maybe just changing your routine a little bit is all you need, walking away, changing the subject in the moment. And after a while, even the most dense person will probably get a clue that you'd rather not talk about what somebody else is doing, you want to talk about work. So just keep that in mind, because you never know where that can backfire.
Oh, thanks. I was just going to answer that. Just, you know, to say, well, you know, I really don't want to talk about that. I don't. want to be a person who talks about other people, just to not engage, or because like it's so easy as a human condition to go, oh, really, that's so fascinating. But just to be, you know, either, I mean, I don't want to ignore them because I don't want to be rude, but I would just like to say, you know, something like, well, I'd really rather not gossip, and I'd like to get to know so-and-so for myself, and you know, maybe change the subject, or just don't engage and don't continue to feed them, because they might want attention, and if you keep feeding that, you may get a tornado that'll never end.
Sure, it could turn into a Hurricane Irene right there in the office. So I said there were, oh, okay, go ahead, Carol.
Another reason to walk away is because they're gossiping about one person, but then when you're not there, what are they saying about you?
Yeah. Yeah, it's not like these things happen in a vacuum. They'll just suck in everything. So I said there were probably half a dozen ways, and we've covered relationships a little bit. We've talked a little bit about the global perspective with your boss directly and with your immediate coworkers. One important area that someone mentioned earlier in the summit is workplace ethics. How are you going to act when no one else is watching you? Can I trust you to do your job when I'm not there? Can I trust you when I am there to really be doing the work that's been assigned to you? And let's talk about stealing for a minute. What's the most common form of stealing, do you think? Time. Yes, time. Office supplies is probably up there too. But time is so easy. And you know, if you steal 10 minutes a day from your employer, that's actually more than a week a year, about 42 hours a year. 10 minutes a day that you're Facebooking or online gambling or gossiping or whatever it is, taking that extra smoke break, whatever it is, 10 minutes a day adds up over time. What could you have accomplished with that extra week of work? Maybe you could have done something to impress your boss and keep your job in leaner times. So there's all sorts of ways of stealing, but don't forget that time, although intangible, you can steal that from someone. That's a form of theft. Lies on your resume or application, that's a workplace ethic issue as well. The estimates are very high about how many resumes contain lies. And that can really backfire on you. I remember one job I got, I'd worked for a large insurance company, and they were very, very cheap, especially with claims offices. I worked in a claims office. We were just a cost center, and they treated us like redheaded stepchildren. So I remember going to one regional meeting. The region had everything, of course, gilded sinks and, you know, little people flitting around with wings to bring them grapes or whatever it was. That's how it seemed to us. We went to a regional meeting, and we knew that we were invited there just to be their audience. They didn't really want us to talk. So we're sitting there in the audience, and then one day, one grizzled old vet stands up and says, and this is around 1995, when are you going to give us fax machines? He asked a question. He asked the regional director. We were all shocked that somebody had the nerve to stand up. The regional director explained to us that there was a study underway to discuss the feasibility of fax machines in the claims offices. In the meantime, the diner next door had a fax machine. So we just fax over our sandwich orders and pick them up in 15 minutes. But they had to do a study first to see if we could get one. And eventually, they rolled out a fax machine to the claims offices. It was a home fax, and it was refurbished. It was not a business fax. So they told us, don't tell anyone that you've even got this fax machine. It's only for us to communicate with you. It's not for anyone else to communicate to you. You know, this kind of thing is just, it was mind-boggling that they would use their power that way, and so we had to keep it a secret. Most people would just lie and tell people on the outside, we don't have a fax machine. And I would just tell people, well, I can't tell you the number, which I don't know which was lamer. When you're talking to another insurance company, you tell them, oh, we want to settle the claim today, but I can't tell you the fax number. It was ridiculous. And even in that situation where the machine was always broken and just not working well, we would have people try to use the fax machine for personal use sometimes. That's what the regional office was afraid of. It was broken so much at the time, it was rarely successful, but you know, they were really worried about us misappropriating their equipment. So eventually they bought us computers. We did not have computers in the early 90s. Eventually they went out and bought a bunch of IBMs. They were beautiful, fully functional. They loaded one program on them, and that was Word. WordPerfect, actually, back in the day. Only the secretary got an extra program. She had email and she had Excel, but the rest of us were not allowed to touch her machine, and we could only have a word processing program on the machines throughout our offices. Again, ridiculous. So the company was also concerned about us using their machines in a bad way. Now, people do use machines in different ways, but of course we weren't looking to mess over the company. Eventually I had enough of the penny pinching and all that kind of thing, and I went and found myself another job, and they asked me what I could do on the computer. Well, my entire computer experience had been in that office using that one machine with the one program. And I told them I can use WordPerfect. And they said, and well, that's actually all I've got. Just the WordPerfect, sorry. And they looked at each other. This is a high-tech company. Have you ever worked on a Mac? No, don't even know how to turn it on. And so weeks later, after I got the job, I asked the CTO, why did you hire me in this Mac environment? And he said, well, because you were honest about what you didn't know. If we'd hired you and you said you knew how to work a Mac and you didn't, we would have fired you immediately. We wanted to hire you. You admitted what you didn't know, and so we could work with that as long as you come in honest. And I never forgot that lesson. Because people will put all kinds of things on their resumes. When you fill out the application, you might find yourself signing away some of your perceived rights. You might be saying, if you ever discover anything on this that's incorrect, that I lied, you can terminate me in the moment. I sign under penalty of perjury, things like this. These statements appear in applications. And so you can forget that you lied 5 years ago and then it comes out. I've seen people with criminal histories, and those things are hard. I mean, there's no way around it that's easy. If you've got a criminal history, most employers are going to ask you to fill out an application. Don't write down, yes, I've been convicted of a felony, let's discuss it at the interview. No. Answer the question up front. I know it's hard, but maybe it has nothing to do with your employment. Maybe your felony is that you were, I don't know, actually stealing those little white plastic things from the post office, those letter carrier white plastic things. Stealing one of those is a felony. So maybe that's your felony. You walked off with property of the U.S. Postal Service. They're a federal entity. What a horrible thing you did, right? But that's got nothing to do with you being a service provider, perhaps. So don't be afraid to put down the truth. The employer wants to know what they're dealing with, and they don't want to then question everything because they found one little lie. Another area I think is important is dealing with romance, workplace romance. Has anyone ever in their entire lives found someone at work they thought was cute? I don't see many hands, but I know you people, come on. We probably all made friends, and sometimes those friends become romances, and employers worry about that. Why do you think that is?
Because it can turn out to be ugly.
Yes, and if it gets ugly, what can happen? Yeah, and maybe I really got it in for Farhang. He dumped me. He dumped me at the party, and I have no idea what he thinks he's doing because now I'm going to make sure he pays. And so maybe I'm going to start accusing Farhang of harassment. And it's just a bad breakup.
I don't do that.
I know you don't, which is why I'm picking on you, Farhang. So maybe I've created a tense workplace for other people. Maybe this gets big and I'm dragging other people into it. Some employers will ask you to sign love contracts, which are ridiculous. So, well, some employers will say you can't date somebody else on the job. Some will say you can't date a subordinate or a superior. It's hard to enforce love contracts, so not a lot of employers use them, but they are out there. It's much better, and I think in our handbook, it says you've got to tell your supervisor and HR if you're involved in a relationship, and that way, if it does go badly, we can at least say, well, we knew about it, and it ended this way, and we sort of just, we want to be aware of it. We don't want to monitor it. We don't want to call you in the office every day for updates. We just want to know what's going on so that if things go awry and one person starts accusing the other, at least somebody else was aware that the situation was happening. And that leads to something else that you can do that relates to ethics, keeping something important to yourself. If you know about a situation like that, there's some harassment going on in the workplace and you don't say anything, what do you think the employer is going to think of you when it comes to light? Are they going to say, well, we understand that you wanted to protect so-and-so's privacy? What do you think? The law says that an employer, if they know or should have known about harassment, that they could be on the hook. Not just the entity that's employing you, but people within the company could have personal liability because they knew or should have known. And so if I know something's going on and I don't tell Brian, then I didn't protect LightHouse, I didn't protect him. What if somebody goes after his assets because he allowed the situation to brew that I knew about and I just didn't feel like getting involved and telling him? So you've got a bit of personal responsibility when ethics are there to share something that's important, that could be serious, that could explode in the employer's face. That's not always easy to do, I know.
Yeah, the question is, how can you tell when it's life-threatening or, you know?
It doesn't have to be life-threatening to rise to something important. Most of us have a feel for what's important. If you know that Kathy Abrahamson comes to work drunk every day, and she does. Oh, did I say? I'm sorry.
Drunk on life.
Kathy reminded me that we're on live stream. I shouldn't joke like that. Sorry, Kathy. She's right. But let's say that you knew Kathy had an issue with alcohol and she was driving clients around. Would you want to keep that to yourself? If Kathy is just drunk at her desk, maybe you would choose to opt out of it. I don't really want to care. And I did work with a woman who drank. I don't know how she hid it. She was obviously drunk, but we could never smell it on her, never catch her drinking. I think it was the morning coffee. There was more than cream and sugar in there. But you could tell from her face and from the way she was acting that she was drinking on the job. And eventually, she was terminated, not for that, but for disclosing confidential information by email, which she probably did under the influence. You know, she didn't care anymore, and she hit send, and boom. Someone has a comment?
Well, it used to be, because when I was a restaurant owner, I had 6 employees, and one of my cooks used to go out and sit in his car on his lunchtime and drink. And we were trained as employers through BEP that you were not allowed to fire someone or terminate someone who you thought was under the influence, because you had to know for sure. It could have been mouthwash. It could have been anything.
And some drugs will give you the effect of being intoxicated.
Exactly, or they could have a neurological condition or whatever. So I fired him anyway and was willing to put up with the unemployment because I did not want to have somebody drunk on the premises. And we had eyewitnesses watching him put a liquor bottle up to his lips. So, I mean, we had witnesses, but you have to be careful about, as an employer, about firing somebody that you think is drinking unless you physically have seen him do that.
Well, if you report that someone is drinking to me, does that mean I have to fire them? No.
You have to investigate. Yeah.
I might have to investigate. And if it's not a performance issue, the law may say I don't really have grounds to fire them. If they are under the influence, maybe they're in a treatment program, if they're an alcoholic, maybe they just like their wine with lunch, it's not affecting their performance, firing someone could be risky. But that's why when I painted the scenario, I said, what if a service provider is out there driving people around under the influence?
Julie, this is Debbie Bacon. Wouldn't that also come under health and safety, though?
Yeah, it could.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we're really looking at the consequences of the behavior more than the behavior itself. Michael?
And that's why it's also very important that you are honest on your applications about conditions that you may have, because being diabetic, I may appear to be drunk or smell like I've been drinking, and it has nothing to do with alcohol.
Mm-hmm. Building a good, strong relationship with your boss, letting them know what you need to be successful. You know, I've got diabetes and I might exhibit these symptoms, I'm dyslexic, whatever it is. Once you're in the door, let your boss know what they need to know to manage the situation. Now, I've only got 2 more sections and I'm out of time, so I'm going to kind of rush through this. We've talked about relationships, we've talked about ethics a little bit. Let's talk about dealing with conflict. Now, I remember talking to one of you in a mock interview who told me, you know what, I've never had a conflict with anyone in the workplace. And that was really surprising to me, because anyone who's worked for more than, I don't know, an hour, it's probably subject to some sort of conflict. My best advice there is to try to resolve it one-on-one where possible. What I see most of the time is avoidance. I've got an issue with Tony Fletcher, and I don't tell Tony, I tell everyone but Tony. What if I just pulled Tony aside and said, you know what, Tony, this is bothering me? Maybe that's all it would take. Maybe he doesn't know that it bothers me. Maybe he doesn't know it bothers me as much as it does. Maybe I'm the one with the problem, and if we talk one-on-one, we'll find that out. But instead of telling everybody in the world, try the one-on-one approach, and do it in person. Don't write it in an email, because people can intone things in an email that you didn't mean, or they could share it with someone you didn't intend. Try a one-on-one conversation. It can do wonders. Consider alternatives if you cannot resolve it yourself, and apologize even if it's not your fault. Consider that. That's hard to do, but most of you will probably do it in your personal relationships, right? Someone is nagging in your ear, a friend, a loved one. You didn't do it, they did it, but will you just apologize sometimes to end the argument? Yeah. That can be applied to work as well. Maybe you didn't do it, but you'll apologize just to move on. And if you can't solve the problem one-on-one and you can't agree on some alternative solution or a third party, some sort of arbitration, you might need to document it a little bit and review the conflict resolution policies in your employee manual. You might have to take some steps to get this resolved. My last area, moving on. This is the 6th area, because the next job you get probably won't be the job from which you retire. And so how can you move on in a constructive, positive way? Any ideas briefly? No? You just walk out and I see a hand in the back.
I'm coming.
That's a good way to lose weight. I think one of the most important things you can do is be sure that you've got a good reference with your previous employer.
You don't want to burn bridges, do you?
Yeah.
Just a little bit ago, I was on the computer and I saw a story about a woman who was just arrested in Rotterdam for stalking her boyfriend by phone. Guess how many times she called him in a year? Shamika's been looking. 65,000 times in 1 year. Which someone did the math, and that's about, what was it, one time every, I think it was 11 times an hour for 16 hours a day. I think someone did the math. And so finally the guy couldn't take it anymore, and he called the police, and they arrested the woman. They confiscated phones and computers from her. Can you imagine spending your life? And she said, well, they were in a relationship. She didn't think it was excessive, 65,000 times. The guy says, we were not in a relationship. Yeah, how about moving on with some grace? So if you move on from a situation, you want to give proper notice whenever that's possible. You want to continue to perform your duties as expected. I talked to one woman in an interview setting. Why are you leaving your present job? People always give me fluffy answers that really don't relate to the truth. This woman said, I'm leaving my job because me and my boss don't get along. I was shocked. No one ever admits that in an interview. Tell me more, I said. She said, I was the executive assistant to Boss A. We got along well. We worked together as a team for years. Boss A got transferred. Now I'm working for Boss B. We have completely different styles. We're not getting along. We've sat down and talked about it and figured out the best thing we can do is for me to move on. He's not going to move on. So I need to move on. I said, what would Boss B say if I called him about you right now? And she said, with complete confidence, he'd tell you what a great job I'm doing. He knows I'm here. I'm doing everything I'm supposed to be doing. I'll leave when it's mutually beneficial. They had this agreement worked out like adults. It was amazing. She was going to walk away from that job with his support. She could say we didn't get along because she knew if you checked, her references were going to be solid. And she was not going to burn that bridge. So be professional and courteous and keep doing your job till the end. A lot of times when people decide to leave, they become fruit from the poison tree, and they're just poisoning everyone around them. They're bitter, they're disruptive, they're not doing their work. Don't go out like that. You don't know when you're going to need that employer again or somebody that you met there. Maybe you're going to need a reference from one of your colleagues.
Julie, this is Ramona, and I was going to say that exact same thing.
Right.
You might wind up back at that employer.
Yeah.
And so you definitely don't want to burn any bridges.
Or you may meet one of those ex-colleagues at your next job, and you don't want them saying, you hired Ramona? Really? So you've got to be careful. A lot of people think it's illegal for an employer to give a reference on you. It is not illegal. Most employers, because they're afraid, will only give name, rank, and serial number. Yes, Shin Kwan worked here, that's all I'm going to say. But if they wanted to give more information, they could. And if Shin has signed away his rights, maybe he gave them they gave him a form to sign and he signed away, you can talk to my employer about anything, who knows what could come out.
Okay, well, question.
Yeah.
Do you have to sign that, waiver thing when it says, can we contact your other employer?
Well, it depends. If you don't sign it, what message are you sending to that prospective employer?
Either way, you're like in a catch-22.
But if I ask you to sign a waiver so I can talk to your ex-employees, your ex-employer, and you say no, isn't that a red flag for me?
Yeah.
And in some situations, Kathy, didn't we have an ex-employee? The feds came out and interviewed us about him, right? He was going for a federal job. Some guy with a badge showed up, badge and an attitude, as I recall. and talked to Tony and Kathy about one of our ex-colleagues who'd worked there previously. It wasn't good enough just to get the reference over the phone. I've never seen that happen before. And I know somebody who worked for the UN.
That's happened to me before. My friend wanted to get a background check.
Uh-huh.
They came to my house and asked me about her.
Yeah.
So
I worked for the CHP very briefly, and the officers would go out and interview your neighbors. And as soon as they found out that these guys were CHP because they wore suits you didn't know right off the bat, they would spill their guts about everything you'd been doing. Your neighbors. You know, you've watched their dog and you fed their kids, and then somebody comes out and says, Joe Blow has applied for a job with California Highway Patrol. What can you tell me? Ugh, Joe has a marijuana farm in his yard right now. And he's out there whenever he's not too drunk to tend to his plants, you know. People would just give you up. You never know.
Again, it is kind of hard because you can't get along with everybody. And so to sign that paper and then have to, I guess, clean up behind yourself or, you know, do
Well, you've got some choices to make when you're on the job, don't you? How are you going to handle situations that come up? I had two women when my first supervisory job. They would be in the break room threatening to beat each other up in the parking lot. Well, we'll just take this outside. Yeah, I guess we will. Blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, dudes, what are you doing? I mean, you've got decisions to make. Are you going to go outside and duke it out? Are you going to try to talk it out? Are you going to let the boss know that there's a problem in the office? I mean, you've got some control over how situations are resolved. So you don't want to lose it on the job and then have that come back and haunt you. All somebody can remember about you is, oh yeah, you should have seen the way he flipped out when somebody stepped on his toe. You don't want that to be your legacy, but it could be.
When I used to terminate employees, when I hired employees, in the handbook after they were hired, there was a little form and a little thing they signed that said I had the right to withhold their final check unless they signed the termination document.
Ooh.
And
This
that
is in
worked
California?
pretty well. Yeah, but this is back in the 90s, and it was legal then.
Oh.
And so I was able to do that, and I always got my way.
Wow. So you could withhold their check if what? What was the condition?
What's that?
You could withhold their check if what?
If they didn't sign all the severance materials document, the severance document.
And what would be the value of them signing those documents? Were they signing away anything or affirming anything?
Yeah, they were signing away some things, and they were confirming the hours that they, the last severance that they received. They're receiving the severance check and the amount of hours. It was covering me that was standard back then in handbooks.
That's remarkable. I worked for one employer who was one of the .coms going under. We weren't being paid regularly at the end, and we were asking people to sign things before they got their final checks. I remember going down to, I think, the EEOC, defending the employer who hadn't paid me in 9 weeks either. Wow. And they were saying, why are you making people sign for their own money? You can't do that. And that was in the 90s. So I'm not saying that there was anything wrong with your situation, but yeah.
And that's what she recommended. And
well, I'm glad it worked out for you.
Yeah.
I'll put it that way. So just remember, those of you who, when you get that job, work on relationships, workplace ethics, conflict resolution, because you will have conflict, and then when you move on, do it with as much grace as possible. Maybe we can talk after at dinner. Thank you very much for your time.